Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we are going to talk a little bit about Vanda orchids, specifically trying to demystify a little bit this myth that Vandas cannot really be grown in pots, or they're not going to do so well, or the best way to grow Vandas is bare-rooted or mounted or things of the sorts. We're also going to repot one of my Vandas, which surprisingly enough outgrew her clay pot already in a few months. You're gonna see what I'm talking about. But as you guys might already know, I have switched to the potted setup for my Vandas after I myself have been wary of growing them in pots. Well, it takes a super hot climate and not enough time and quite a lot of frustration to make the jump, because hey, there is actually nothing wrong with keeping Vandas potted. So we're going to address that in the most logical way possible and of course show you some examples. So with that said, don't forget to give this video a like if you end up enjoying it, and why not subscribe? I post 3 times a week. Also, small reminder, we have a fundraiser campaign going on. All profits will go to Doctors Without Borders. We've created a special merch line called Orchids at Heart. Check it out in the description. You're gonna learn more about it there. And with that said, I think it's time to start. Alright, so historically, Vandas have been known for those really big orchids with a big root system that really need to be kept hanging or non-potted in any case, because otherwise they would not do well. What contributed to this opinion we had of them? Well, the fact that they were sold bare-rooted most of the time, in comparison to Phalaenopsis, which were always potted. That was a pretty shocking difference. Depending on the region, you could have found these Vandas in big, tall vases, which were very expensive, or simply just hanging on a wire hanger. I don't know if in flower shops you can actually find potted Vandas. Furthermore, you do have quite a lot of forum discussions, even articles that suggest you should keep your Vanda orchid bare-rooted. And on top of that, you had YouTube videos, such as mine, telling you how great Vandas do bare-rooted. And yeah, they do absolutely great bare-rooted. It's actually not a specific trait of Vandas. It's a trait of very drought-tolerant epiphytic orchids in general. With the Phalaenopsis or Oncidium or Zygopetalum or Cattleya, being that they're not necessarily very big plants, it's kind of easy to put them in the pot, put them for sale. You can keep them tidy. It's great. But imagine putting a full-size Vanda orchid in a really big pot being shipped across the world. Can you imagine how much space it would take, how much more expensive these Vandas will end up to be? They're already expensive in flower shops. Yeah, that's not good. So it's actually easier to transport them bare-rooted and sell them bare-rooted than to actually put them in airy pots. Now, the fact that Vandas really do enjoy their air doesn't really help either. But after 8 years of experience with Vandas only, I can tell you that I don't think they're much different than Phalaenopsis or Cattleyas when it comes to air requirements around their roots. The problem is they don't come potted, so the roots they have, they're already adjusted to being aerial, quote unquote, even though all roots are aerial. But Phalaenopsis and Dendrobiums and Cattleyas and all of these orchids, they have grown ever since they were seedlings in pots. Hence, the roots have adapted to that particular air to moisture ratio. When we try to pot Vandas, especially when they have been bare-rooted all of this time, it doesn't end well. But here's the catch. It would not end well for Phalaenopsis or Cattleyas or Dendrobiums either. Those just happen to be already adjusted. That's the only difference. So in recent years, I kind of gave up on the idea of keeping them bare-rooted or very airy, because it just doesn't work out for me. It's not the climate to do that, and not the particular person to have the time to do that every day or multiple times a day. Hence, I had to take the leap, and I did. And oh boy, I will never go back to bare-rooted Vandas. But enough about me. Now let's talk about you. The true truth, if you will, is that Vandas can be grown bare-rooted, mounted, in baskets, in glass vases, as long as you don't keep them in full water all the time, or potted. They are all good, suitable, viable setups. What makes them suitable or unsuitable for you is how they actually work. And pretty much it's all in the details, because I can say my Vanda is potted and it's okay, but if I have soil in here, then all of a sudden it's not okay anymore. We need to remember the 3 rules, which I don't think I'm gonna call rules anymore, but 3 principles of orchid setups that make them suitable in accordance to the actual nature of the orchid. Number one, the setup we choose needs to allow us to water the orchid. And that's absolutely true. If water doesn't reach the orchid, doesn't get to the roots, the orchid will dehydrate and die. It's pretty obvious, right? Yeah, well, there are cases in which some setups don't really allow for proper watering. And if your setup is one of those, then maybe you should reconsider it, because orchids, just like any other plants, need water. Two, and this is a tricky one, the setup we go for needs to allow air circulation or provide enough air to be within the orchid's requirements. And the reason why this is tricky is because different orchids do have different, let's say, air to moisture ratios, but this can totally be controlled. Bottom line is, all orchids, even the terrestrial ones, need air. In fact, they actually need more air than maybe a tomato or many types of trees or plants or weeds we find in nature, because orchids are just a little bit different. And in cultivation, most of the orchids we have do require a certain air ratio, even if they are considered terrestrial. They're not the type of plants that grow in heavy clay soils. They don't usually come from swampy locations. So even if they're terrestrials and naturally grow in soil, they still like to have a more aerated mix than many other plants. And third rule or principle, obviously the setup and the medium we choose needs to not be toxic or detrimental, abrasive in any way to the root system. And here I will include media that either, as I was saying, are abrasive and scratch the root tips, either are leaching out substances which burn the roots, either they're too acidic, and the list can go on. Reason why some materials such as unprepared coconut husk, which is full of salts, are just not suitable for orchids. Yes, coconut husk is okay for orchids, but if it hasn't been desalinized, it really isn't good for orchids. It will chemically burn the root system. Besides these three principles, which are universal, no matter where you live, no matter what orchid you have, they're kind of logical principles, right? So besides them, it's all in the particular details that apply to you. For example, some materials will not perform in the same way in various environments with different temperatures, different humidity levels, and so on. Furthermore, not all materials are equal. Some of them are better quality, some are not. The degree of skill of each particular grower plays an important part, actually. If I look back at myself 3 years ago, I had much less skill level than I do today. And it's normal. The more we go through things, the more we grow orchids, the more experience, the more skill we will acquire. So what didn't work then, we might make work now simply because we have a better understanding of things, and that's okay. And also, a thing that nobody mentions, the availability of these products in your area. You are far more likely to take better care of your orchid if all of these materials are easily available. You can switch them like that. You're not gonna cut corners like reusing stuff you shouldn't reuse, and so on and so forth. Then if you're using materials that are very, very hard to obtain, and rather than you repotting when you should repot, you're just gonna wait another year, because what's the worst that can happen? Oh, things can happen. And the list is actually huge. There are a lot of details that go into it that make certain setups work for us or simply be disastrous. However, all of this doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things, because just because we cannot make something work doesn't mean that that particular something doesn't work, as long as it respects the three principles of growing an orchid, respecting its nature, not trying to make it something it's not. And when it comes to pots, yeah, maybe some people are really, really not happy with potted vandas. And maybe it has to do with their environment, maybe the materials, maybe the pots they're using, but that's absolutely fine and it's normal, because if you don't like pots, you can grow them in baskets, bare-rooted, whatever. You can go for any of these setups. They're all equally great for vandas. You just have to be comfortable with them and know how to control them to some extent, because this is a very unnatural setup we have for these orchids. Unless you actually live where these orchids are coming from and you can put them on the tree and just forget about them, we're gonna have to invent a little bit of a system, a little bit of a setup for them. Even if we keep them hanging bare-rooted from our window, it's still not very natural, but hey, it is what we need to do. And if it works out, that's great. Are there inconveniences? Yes, absolutely. When I'm going to repot this orchid, I'll have to be very careful how I detach it from the actual pot. But if I'm careful and I soak the roots properly, I think it's gonna be okay. I'm also gonna choose a time when the orchid is actively producing roots so I minimize a little bit the shock. And also because the pot is big enough, I don't really need to repot this orchid all that soon. Since the medium is not wet all of the time, it's rather dry than wet, this medium will not decompose all that fast. Does it mean it's the best setup ever? No, absolutely not. There's really no such thing. So now that we talked a little bit about the logic behind growing orchids in different types of setups, let's see how easy it is to repot one of these orchids. And the Vanda that I want to repot today, this is a surprise. This is the Vanda Maruli variety Rotori that I bought half a year ago, not more. And I potted it in this beautiful pot, and in 6 months, it grew twice its size. When I got it, it was the length of my palm pretty much. Now, it's a little longer than the length from my fingertips to my elbow. What? No Vanda ever grew so fast. We're gonna talk a little bit more about this orchid in Friday's video. I think I'm gonna do a then and now inspired by this orchid. The thing is, Vandas don't necessarily need to have all of their roots inside the pot. They can definitely grow around and outside. That's okay. I just want the bigger chunk of roots inside the pot for hydration purposes. So at some point I can stop going up in size with Vandas. This will be a big Vanda when she is mature, and this pot is really tiny. So I want to be proactive about it and not let the roots or the vast majority of the roots attach to this pot. I'm going to switch it to a bit of a bigger pot. Alright, so what I will be using is the same type of medium, bark and sphagnum moss, and also an IKEA clay pot. Excuse you. I like these pots because they come with really deep trays. And this is what I need because I do water my orchids by letting water pool in the dish and then getting absorbed by the mixture that I'm preparing. Excuse my birds, they just have something to discuss. If you want to know a little more about my watering technique and how I adapted my entire setup to ease my life with watering, I'll link you to my video down below. It explains everything in depth. And while I unpot this orchid, let me tell you a funny story about the IKEA pots. Because I do have my Vandas all in clay pots, and for the life of me I cannot find suitable trays for them. I have some flimsy plastic trays that are just not suited for the weight of the pot. I have found that these particular trays are the best. So when IKEA restocked them, I bought myself a lot of these trays and just a few pots just to have there. And when I got to the cashier, to my surprise, they told me they don't actually sell the trays separately. So I couldn't buy only the trays. I needed to buy the pots as well. And I thought, well, I really want those trays. And I'm sure I can find a use for the pots as well. So now I have 26 pots in my staircase, which will get used, but I will not have to buy pots for a lot of time from now on. Alright, so because this is a fairly new orchid, I don't believe it has attached too much. Also, I recently watered it, so it's still damp. I am not going to pull from the stem because this is a tiny orchid in comparison. I don't want to damage anything. I'm going to try to go right beneath it and just pull up from the root ball, as it were. And let's see. It is a little attached, but not a lot. Ooh, look at that. I did not damage any root. There's no root stuck to this pot because it's already damp. I just watered this orchid yesterday. And you can see it's not soggy, it's just damp. And yes, as I was fearing, the roots have already taken over that tiny little pot. Look at this. I'm thinking I can actually reuse. Should I reuse the medium? It's been 6 months. It's not a good idea to disturb Vanda roots all too much. So if I reuse this medium, it will pretty much shave off 6 months of the total time in which I can use the new medium. And with Vandas, it's not worth it. So no, I'm not gonna reuse this medium. If this orchid would have been potted in a plastic pot, it would have been an oncidium or even better a phalaenopsis, I would have totally reused the medium. So as usual, I will start with a layer of sphagnum moss on the bottom, even though this pot is very, very, very wicking. So water will be absorbed from the bottom and directed all the way to the top. Theoretically, I don't need to start with sphagnum moss, but there are cases in which the pores of the clay can get a little bit clogged by salts. And just in case that happens, I want to have a backup. I want to put sphagnum moss at the bottom just to make sure it is in direct contact with the water, and it will direct all of that water from the dish up into the medium. So let's see about the level, because this orchid is a little deep. Perfect, if I do say so myself. So I'm just gonna pour medium around the roots, alternating sphagnum moss with bark. I do this because I do want to make sure that the moss is in contact with the layers below, just to make sure the water is indeed brought up to the top efficiently by the sphagnum moss. On the last layer of sphagnum moss, I like to place slow release fertilizer. I'm using Osmocote High K, and with Vandas, it really does make a difference. Vandas are not light feeders. I've seen heavier feeders, but generally speaking, and particularly if they are in a, let's say, younger size, they do eat up quite a lot of fertilizer. I don't know if I've ever had deposits on Vanda roots or anything of the sort. They just eat up everything. And the last layer, as usual, is a bark layer. This will make sure that the moss layer will not accumulate algae, which is a fairly common problem here in my climate. And there we go. All I need to do now is just water it. A little PS, some people have the tendency to soak clay pots prior to using them. I never do that because if I water them properly and of course leave water in the tray for the pot to absorb, I pretty much end up with the same results. So I don't really bother with soaking the pots prior to use. And there we have it. And here we are, all done. Quick notes before I let you go. With the IKEA trays, I discovered it is always a good idea to add or spray them with a layer of clear coat because they're not sealed. I don't know why they do that. The tray should not be unglazed because what it will do is absorb the moisture and then seep it out on the furniture, and you don't really want to do that. So I always use a clear coat of varnish on the inside of the tray, and that solved my issues pretty much. Also, I do believe I can get away with these Vandas with a very, very ventilated pot, maybe one that has a lot of ventilation holes. Yeah, I absolutely think that would work as well, but if you remember how I ended up with potted Vandas in these pots, the plastic pots I used to have them in started to crack because of the sun. Since I grow my Vandas outside pretty much all the time except winter, they weren't really quality pots and they all started to crack and my Vandas kept falling. And I already had clay pots left over from when I moved here 4 years ago. So I thought, well, if this is not a good opportunity to reuse them, I don't know which is. So that's why they're all kind of in clay pots. As you can see, this one is in a glazed clay pot, but it does have some ventilation holes. This is a Repotting pot. I'll link you to them down below. So if you like more decorative stuff, but still want to have some aeration, these are great. Works just as well since they have so much aeration. And in the end, really the setup is up to you. There really is no such thing as orchids need to be grown like this or like that, or if you don't do something like somebody else, it's not good. You know what I'm saying? No, you just have to find what works out for you, but do remember the 3 principles, because these principles are not rules necessarily invented by me. I kind of just figured them out as I went. Water, aeration, medium that is not damaging to roots. Makes sense, right? As long as you follow these 3, then any setup you find can potentially be good. You have to test it out, you have to trial and error it, see if it works with your lifestyle, environment, the materials you can find available, and so on and so forth. And that is about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed hanging out with me today. Stay tuned for Friday. We are going to talk a little bit more about this fast-growing Vanda, and I'll show you how it looked like 6 months ago, together with some other orchids which I discovered changed a lot in the past few years. Don't forget to check out the Orchids at Heart merch down below. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. With that said, I'll see you next time. Bye!